For nearly 3 decades, back in the 5th century BCE, the Greek world just tore itself apart. Now, this wasn't just any war, it was a total war. It pitted neighbor against neighbor, it shattered a golden age, and it completely redrew the map of power in the ancient world. This is the story of the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that ends with the tragic fall of Athens. The Athenian historian and general Thucydides, a guy who actually lived through it all, he knew right from the start that this thing was going to be monumental. He got the stakes, he got the scale, and he understood its devastating potential. So he dedicated his life to writing it all down, so that people like us, generations later, could understand what happened. All right, to really get this epic tragedy, we're going to walk through 5 key acts. First, how the world was divided. Then, the grinding stalemate of the war's first phase. After that, the single biggest mistake Athens ever made. And finally, its collapse, and the grim aftermath for all of Greece. So let's dive right into Act 1. At the very heart of this war were 2 city-states, 2 alliances, and two completely different ways of life, both locked in a massive struggle for dominance. On one side, you had Athens. Think of it as this vibrant, seafaring democracy leading what was called the Delian League, which had basically become an Athenian maritime empire. Then on the other side, you've got Sparta, a super rigid, military-first society run by an oligarchy that's ruled by a select few. Sparta's whole deal was its legendary land army of hoplites, these heavily armed foot soldiers, and they ran their own alliance, the Peloponnesian League. It really was a classic clash, sea power versus land power, democracy versus oligarchy. You can see how conflict was pretty much inevitable. So the war kicks off in 431 BCE, but here's the thing, neither side could land a knockout blow. What came next was a brutal decade of raids, sieges, and just immense suffering, a phase we now call the Achaemenid War. The basic strategy was pretty simple. Sparta would march into Athenian territory every year, trying to force a big land battle. But the Athenians would just retreat behind their massive city walls and use their powerful navy to raid Sparta's coasts instead. This grinding pattern was horribly broken, though, by an enemy nobody saw coming. A horrific plague swept through crowded Athens. It killed 1/3 of the entire population, including their brilliant leader, Pericles. The war just dragged on until 422 BCE at the Battle of Amphipolis, where in this really strange twist of fate, the most aggressive, pro-war generals from both sides were killed. That kind of paved the way for a very fragile truce. And get this, here's a little detail that I think is just amazing. Who was serving in the Athenian ranks this whole time, fighting as a common foot soldier, a hoplite in these brutal campaigns? None other than the philosopher Socrates. It's just a cool reminder that this epic history was lived by real people. But that peace, it didn't last. The rivalry just kept festering, and a frustrated, exhausted Athens decided to make a really bold move to break the stalemate once and for all. It would turn out to be the single worst decision in its entire history.
So put yourself in their shoes. What's the strategic problem? Athens couldn't beat Sparta's army on land. They needed to find a new front, a way to cripple Sparta's allies and expand their own empire so dramatically that Sparta would just be forced to give up.
The plan they came up with was breathtakingly ambitious. In 415 BCE, Athens launched this massive naval expedition to go conquer Syracuse, the most powerful city on the island of Sicily. The thinking was, if they could control Sicily's huge wealth and resources, they wouldn't just cripple Spartan allies, they'd get an unbeatable advantage for the rest of the war. It was a high-stakes, all-or-nothing imperial gamble. And to put it bluntly, it was an unmitigated disaster, just a total catastrophe. The expedition got bogged down by political drama, really poor leadership, and resistance that was way fiercer than they expected. After 2 years of just brutal fighting, the entire Athenian force was annihilated. Tens of thousands of soldiers and sailors were killed or captured. It was a military disaster on a scale the Greek world had rarely ever seen. That defeat in Sicily left Athens grievously wounded. Its navy was shattered, its treasury was empty, its confidence completely broken. This was the turning point. For Sparta? Well, this was blood in the water. This was the moment to go for the kill. Now remember, Sparta was a land power. They just didn't have the navy or the money to challenge Athens at sea. So, in this stunning geopolitical twist, they made a deal with their old archenemy, the Persian Empire. You heard that right. Persia provided the gold, and Sparta built the fleet. The decisive moment finally came in 405 BCE. The new Spartan admiral, a brilliant and totally ruthless commander named Lysander, cornered the last major Athenian fleet at a place called Aegospotami. For a few days, the Athenians sailed out, trying to start a fight, but Lysander refused. Then he waited. When the Athenian crews had gone ashore to find food, he launched a devastating surprise attack. The result was absolute annihilation. I mean, just look at these numbers. It's staggering. Athens lost nearly its entire fleet, something like 160 ships. Thousands of captured Athenian sailors were just executed on the spot, and Sparta's losses? Minimal. In a single afternoon, Athenian sea power, the foundation of its empire for a century, was just gone, wiped out. Without its navy, Athens was helpless. It couldn't protect the vital grain shipments from the Black Sea that fed its people. Surrounded by a Spartan army on land and blockaded by Lysander's new fleet at sea, the great city of Athens began to starve. In 404 BCE, the jewel of Greece surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. So, Sparta had won, but that victory came at an enormous cost, not just for Athens, but for the entire Greek world. Let's take a look at the legacy of this 3-decade-long war. Now, the end of the war meant a huge shift in what the Greeks called hegemony. That's basically just a word for the leadership or dominance of one state over all the others. So, what was the ultimate fallout? Well, the Athenian Empire was dismantled completely. Sparta took its place as the top dog, but its brutal rule was super unpopular and sparked even more conflict. The real legacy, though, was felt all across Greece. We're talking decades of poverty, depopulation, and just deep bitterness. In the end, all this endless infighting left all the Greek city-states so weak and divided that they became easy prey for a new power rising in the north, Macedon, led by King Philip II and his son, a kid who would soon be known as Alexander the Great. And that leaves us with a final, pretty sobering thought. Sparta got what it wanted, right? It dismantled the Athenian Empire. But in the process, the entire Greek world was exhausted and broken. Its golden age ended forever. So you really have to ask yourself, in a war that caused so much destruction, who was the real loser?